Good afternoon and good morning for some of you guys in the West Coast. I'm Shang Bei, co-chair of Hinshaw Culbertson's Asian Pacific American Affinity Group. Before we begin, I want to make an opening remark. Racial violence plainly exists today. We are constantly reminded of it when we witness all too common scenes of targeted violence. We see violence when Asian Americans wait for a train on the way to work. We see it when they're gunned down at work simply trying to make a living. We see it when Latinx Americans go to Walmart, when Muslims visit houses of worship, or when members of the LGBTQ community simply ask to be acknowledged as people deserving of healthcare. We see it when Black Americans go for a jog, sit at home watching TV, or try to buy groceries. We simply cannot write off these acts of violence as isolated incidences committed by bad apples or someone having a bad day. Instead, we must strive together to understand and combat racial animus, discrimination, and violence in our everyday lives. Today's program looks into the very real history of violence against the AAPI community. This program was meticulously researched by members of the Asian American Bar Association of New York, including Hinshaw's very own Connie Montoya. History, especially violent history, is uncomfortable, but it would be misguided of us to bury our heads in the sand simply to spare ourselves from the stress of facing our past. Looking into our past, warts and all, informs us of our present and will hopefully educate our actions in the future. I believe a bit of education go a long way to fill the blind spots that we all have, or at the very least, save us from making embarrassing ice cream. I want to be clear that the Asian American Bar Association of New York did the research and put together this wonderful script, slides, and program. Hinshaw is honored to have been given the opportunity to perform this program today. Thus, I would like to thank Affinity for making this program possible, and also my co-chair, Andrew Suresh, our fearless DEI leaders, DL Morris and Lexi Ray, and of course, my dear colleagues at Hinshaw for taking the time to learn and perform their roles. Without further ado, I present to you Kung Flu, History of Hostility and Violence Against AAPIs.
We were all shocked and saddened by the wave of anti-Asian hatred and violence that swept the country during the pandemic. The videos of senseless attacks against AAPIs, many of whom were older and vulnerable, were horrific and disturbing.
But what is perhaps more disturbing is that this is nothing new, for there is a long history of hostility and violence against Asian Americans in this country. In our presentation today, we take a look at that history before offering some thoughts about how we might finally escape the cycle of discrimination and violence that has plagued persons of Asian descent in this country since the arrival of the first immigrants.
So first, some context. The gold rush of 1849 brought tens of thousands of would-be miners to California from all around the world. Only the Chinese drew widespread resentment and hostility. The views of Mally Stafford, a New England woman who accompanied her husband to California to mine for gold, were typical of public sentiment. She observed the following about the early days of the gold rush.
The Chinamen were already beginning to crowd white men to the wall. At first, they worked mines that white men had deserted, but gradually, in their own unobtrusive way, possessed themselves of some of the most valuable surface or placer mines. The Chinamen brought bands of ignorant coolies from China, who were in reality mere slaves, subject to his commands and entirely obedient to his authority. The Chinaman steadily and persistently robbed the country of its golden treasure. He sucked the lifeblood from her veins, laid open her rich arteries of treasure, in unremitting toil gathered it up and shipped it to his own land.
The power of Chinese coolieism was quickly weaponized by politicians. In 1851, John Bigler was elected the first governor of California, but he won by fewer than 500 votes, and he faced a tough battle for re-election. To rally support, he seized on racist tropes. In April 1852, he spoke to the state legislature.
To enhance the prosperity and to preserve the tranquility of the state, measures must be adopted to check this tide of Asiatic immigration and prevent the exportation by them of the precious metals which they dig up from our soil without charge and without assuming any of the obligations imposed upon citizens. I allude particularly to a class of Asiatics known as coolies. Vast numbers of the Chinese are immigrating hither, not, however, to avail themselves of the blessings of a free government. They have no desire to become American citizens. They come instead to acquire a certain amount of the precious metals and to return to their native country.
In fact, the Chinese did contribute significantly to their new country. They paid the foreign miners' taxes, helped build local economies, and contributed to the development of trade between China and America. Among them were educated individuals who spoke English. They pushed back against Governor Bigler and the stereotype of the Chinese coolie. Tong Ah-chik, a leader of a family association, wrote a letter to the governor.
Dear Governor, the Chinamen have learned with sorrow that you have published a message against them. Although we are Asiatics, some of us have been educated in American schools and have learned your language. The Chinese in California include laborers, as well as tradesmen, mechanics, gentry, and teachers. None are coolies, if by that word you mean bound men and contract slaves. The poor Chinaman does not come here as a slave. He comes because of his desire for independence.
Ah-chik's efforts fell on deaf ears.
We turn first to acts of hostility and violence against Asian Americans in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There were scores of incidents. For today's presentation, we have selected only a few and sorted them into three broad categories: mob violence, expulsions, and governmental discrimination.
Mob violence. There were many incidents of mob violence in the latter part of the 19th century, continuing into the 20th century. We focus on four: Los Angeles in 1871, Rock Springs in 1885, Hell's Canyon in 1887, and Watsonville in 1930.
The Los Angeles Massacre of 1871. On October 24, 1871, a gunfight broke out between two Chinese gangs in Los Angeles. A white man, a popular rancher, was killed in the crossfire. A police officer was also shot. As word of the shootings spread, a mob of several hundred men went on a rampage. They rounded up every Chinese male they could find and hanged at least 15 of them, one a 15-year-old who had arrived from China a week earlier. This was the largest mass lynching in American history. At least 3 other Chinese men were killed.
The next day, the Daily Alta California described the scene.
The most terrible night Los Angeles has ever known has passed. 12 hours ago, 15 stark, staring corpses hung ghastly in the moonlight, while 6, 7, or 8 others, mutilated, torn, and crushed, lay in our streets, all of them Chinamen. The sad results came, first, of their own bitter feuds between themselves, next, of the infuriated passions of a few of their number, and lastly, of the demoniacal excitement of the lower classes of our community. Horrible beyond description has been the history of these last few hours. Chinamen, helpless, torn, and mangled, more dead than alive, have been dragged by an infuriated, senseless, and reckless crowd through our peaceful streets, to finish what little was left of their agonized existence at the end of the rope, midst of the exultant shouts and jeers of the mob.
One of the victims was Dr. Jean Tong, a respected physician who treated both white and Asian patients. John Johnson, a reporter for the Los Angeles Times who researched the massacre, described what happened.
As Tong was dragged along the street, he tried to strike a bargain with his captors. He could pay a ransom, he said. He had $3,000 in gold in his shop. He had a diamond wedding ring. They could have it all. Instead of negotiating, one of his captors shot him in the mouth to silence him. Then they hanged him, first cutting off his finger to steal the ring.
25 indictments were returned, but only 10 men went to trial. The prosecutors faced significant hurdles. Given the frenzied nature of the rioting, it was difficult to determine who did what to whom. Moreover, a California statute prohibited Chinese witnesses from testifying against any white person, a statute upheld in 1854 when the California Supreme Court decided in People versus Hall that Chinese testimony was inadmissible against a free white citizen charged with murdering a Chinese victim.
In the face of these difficulties, the prosecutors focused on the murder of the well-regarded Dr. Tong. The first defendant to go to trial was Curly Crenshaw, a 22-year-old man of Irish descent, a drifter known to have a reputation of the worst sort.
We have reconstructed the testimony of Ben McLaughlin, a bystander, from a newspaper account. District Attorney Cameron Tom conducted the examination.
Where were you the night of the riot?
Rap Saloon?
Did you see Mr. Crenshaw there?
Yes.
What, if anything, did you see him do?
I saw him leave the saloon with a pistol in his hand. He got on the roof of the Colonel building where many Chinamen lived.
Did he fire his gun?
There were so many people shooting at the time, I couldn't say.
What happened next?
Afterward, he was part of the crowd shooting into a corral behind the building after they cut holes in the roof.
Did you hear Mr. Crenshaw say anything?
Yes, he said he killed 3 Chinamen. He talked about shooting Chinamen for some time.
Defense counsel cross-examined.
Mr. McLaughlin, were you present when Dr. Tong was killed?
No, I was not.
Do you know anything specifically about Dr. Tong's death, such as who killed him, who was present, how it happened?
I'm sorry, but I do not.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Crenshaw took the stand in his own defense. He admitted having drinks and supper at Rap's saloon, but said that he then headed home to bed. He denied telling Ben McLaughlin that he had killed 3 Chinese.
The jury found Crenshaw guilty of manslaughter. In a second trial, 9 other rioters were tried together as accessories to the murder of Dr. Tong. On March 27, 1872, the jury found 2 defendants not guilty, but convicted the remaining 7 defendants of manslaughter.
Crenshaw was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment and the other 7 defendants 2 to 6 years. On appeal, however, the California Supreme Court reversed the convictions, concluding in a terse decision issued May 21, 1873, as follows.
The indictment in this case is fatally defective in that it fails to allege that Dr. Tong was murdered. It is indispensable that it appear by the indictment that death has resulted from the assault and wounding charged. Judgment reversed.
As a result of the reversal, no one was punished for the murder of 18 or more Chinese Americans.
Rock Springs Massacre of 1885. After several strikes by white miners, the United Pacific Railroad started bringing in Chinese men to work the mines in Rock Springs, Wyoming. By 1885, there were nearly 600 Chinese who were willing to work for lower wages.
On the morning of September 2nd, 1885, a fight broke out between white and Chinese miners in the number 6 mine. A Chinese miner was killed with a pick to his skull, and a second Chinese was badly beaten. At the number 3 mine, white miners shot their Chinese coworkers, killing several.
A mob of 150 armed white men, joined by women and children, attacked Chinatown. Many homes were looted, 79 were set ablaze. Some Chinese who were driven out of hiding by the flames were killed in the streets. Others burned to death in their cellars. Several hundred Chinese were chased into the surrounding hills. Altogether, 28 Chinese were killed and 15 others were wounded.
A week later, federal troops escorted many Chinese miners back to Rock Springs. Not all stayed, but some had little choice but to return to work. 16 of the rioters were arrested. The grand jury, however, refused to indict them. The foreman of the grand jury explained.
We have diligently inquired into the occurrence at Rock Springs. Though we have examined a large number of witnesses, no one has been able to testify to a single criminal act committed by a known white person that day.
The 16 men were released after just a few weeks in prison. On their release, a local paper reported that they were, quote, met by several hundred men, women, and children, and treated to a regular ovation, end quote. No one was ever convicted. Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887. The hostility towards Chinese gold miners came to a head in 1887 in Hell's Canyon, Oregon, in the deadliest attack against Chinese immigrants in US history. A gang of 7 horse thieves concocted a plan to murder miners and steal their gold. The first day, several gang members took a position on a hillside above the miners' camp and saw 10 to 13 Chinese. With high-powered rifles, they shot them one by one. They killed all but one instantly. And when he tried to escape, they finished him off with rocks.
The next day, the gang killed 8 more Chinese miners who had arrived in the camp by boat, and then proceeded to a second camp nearby, where they killed 13 more. In total, at least 31 and as many as 34 miners were murdered, their gold stolen and their camps burned, and their bodies thrown into the Snake River.
The horse thieves were charged with murder, but 3 fled and were never caught. 1 turned state's evidence and was not charged. In a 2-day trial that concluded on September 1st, 1888, the other 3 were found not guilty.
George Craig was a rancher who attended the trial. Some years later, he told an interviewer,
I guess if they had killed 31 white men, something would have been done about it. But none of the jury knew the Chinamen or cared much about it, so they turned the men loose.
In 2005, the site was renamed Chinese Massacre Cove, and in 2012, a memorial was installed. Here is Huimei Ho, Vice Chair of the Memorial Committee.
The memorial bears the names of the 10 miners who were identified. It reads, Chinese Massacre Cove, site of the 1887 massacre of as many as 34 Chinese gold miners. No one was held accountable. Partly because they felt sanctioned by the 1882 Exclusion Act, the terrorists and murderers involved in much of the anti-Chinese violence actually came to believe that they were heroes helping to rid the nation of social evils.
Watsonville Riots of 1930. In January 1930, hundreds of white men armed with pistols and clubs walked the streets of Watsonville, California, attacking Filipino men. The rioting was motivated in part by the fears that the Filipino laborers were driving down wages and mixing with white women. On January 10th, D.W. Rohrbach, a justice of the peace in Watsonville and a member of the local anti-Filipino lobby, condemned the Filipinos.
For a wage that a white man cannot exist on, the Filipinos will take the job and through their clannish, low-standard mode of housing and feeding, will soon be well-clothed and strutting about like a peacock to attract the eyes of young American and Mexican girls. Marriages among white and Filipinos soon will be common. And if the present state of affairs continues, there will be 40,000 half-breeds in the state of California before 10 years have passed. We do not advocate violence, but we do feel that the United States should give the Filipinos their liberty and send those unwelcome inhabitants from our shores so that the whites who have inherited this country for themselves and their offspring might live.
A Filipino dance hall in nearby Palm Beach had hired white women to dance with its customers. On January 19th, a mob of white men purported to rescue the women by burning down the dance hall. One local was quoted as saying,
"Taxi dance halls where white girls dance with Orientals may be all right in San Francisco or Los Angeles, but not in our community. We are a small community and have nothing like this before. We won't stand for anything of the kind."
the rioting lasted 5 days as groups of white men harassed Filipino men on the streets and at their places of employment. Filipinos were pulled from their homes and beaten in the streets. Some were thrown off the Pajaro Bridge. On January 23rd, armed rioters injured 50 Filipino laborers at nearby farms. They shot up a bunkhouse and killed 22-year-old Fermin Tobera as he slept. No one was charged with Tobera's murder, although 8 men were arrested for the raids on the farms. They pleaded guilty to rioting and were sentenced to probation or 30 days in jail, and they were told to refrain from agitation against the darker races.
Expulsions. We turn to the next category, expulsions, that is. Efforts literally to drive Asians out of town. These occurred repeatedly in 1885 and 1886. At least 168 communities in the West drove out their Chinese residents. We highlight 3 episodes today: Eureka in 1885, Seattle in 1886, and Bellingham in 1907.
Eureka, California, 1885. In February 1885, the entire Chinese population of Eureka, California, 300 men and 20 women, was expelled from the city. A white man had been caught in crossfire between 2 Chinese men. Within minutes, an angry mob gathered, shouting, "Burn Chinatown, burn Chinatown." 600 white men gathered on the edge of Chinatown and ordered all Chinese residents to leave Eureka within 48 hours. A makeshift gallows was constructed and a sign was posted saying that any Chinese still in town after 3 p.m. on Saturday would be hanged. These Chinese were put on 2 steamships and taken to San Francisco. 52 Chinatown businesses and residences sued the city of Eureka for damages. The courts ruled against them, holding that they had no standing to sue because they were not legal citizens and therefore could not legally be landowners.
Seattle, Washington, 1886. On February 7th, 1886, a group of men affiliated with the Knights of Labor mobilized to expel all Chinese from Seattle, Washington. There were about 3,000 Chinese immigrants who had taken jobs with pay and conditions that white workers were unwilling to accept. The King County Sheriff, John McGraw, described the scene.
On Sunday morning, a messenger informed me that the Chinese were being forced from their homes and driven to the steamship Queen of the Pacific to be transported to San Francisco. I immediately went to the Chinese quarter of town, and there I saw men assisting in packing up the effects of the Chinese and loading them onto wagons, and met squads of Chinamen going towards the wharf, each squad escorted by 3 or 4 white men, followed by a rabble. The mob numbered 1,500, composed of the discontented element in Seattle, reinforced by delegations from Tacoma, Portland, and other places.
Sheriff McGraw tried to intervene, but about 350 Chinese were rounded up and led to the port. The rioters had funds to pay for 97 fares, and the next day they raised enough for an additional 115. Federal troops were summoned to restore order. By the time the troops left, only a handful of Chinese merchants and domestic servants remained in Seattle.
Bellingham, Washington, 1907. On September 4, 1907, in Bellingham, Washington, a mob of 500 white men, including members of the Asiatic Exclusion League, attacked the homes of South Asian Indians, many of whom worked at local lumber mills. The cry, "Drive out the Hindus," was heard throughout the city. The mob threw the workers into the streets, beat them, and stole their valuables. By the next day, hundreds were driven out of town, and within days, the entire South Asian population was gone. No rioters were arrested or prosecuted. The local newspapers weighed in on the riots. While they did not approve of the violence, they were pleased with the end result. There were editorials in the Bellingham Herald, the Reveillees, and the Seattle Morning Times.
Bellingham Herald. The Hindu is not a good citizen. It would require centuries to assimilate him, and this country need not take the trouble. Our racial burdens are already heavy enough to bear.
Reveille. While any good citizen must be opposed to the violent means employed, the result of the crusade against the Hindus cannot but cause a general and intense satisfaction, and the departure of the Hindus will leave no regrets.
The Morning Times. The matter is not a question of race, but of wages, not a question of men, but modes of life, not a matter of nations, but of habits of life. When men who require meat to eat and real beds to sleep in are ousted from their employment to make room for vegetarians who can find the bliss of sleep in some filthy corner, it is rather difficult to say at what limit indignation ceases to be righteous.
Governmental discrimination. Finally, our third category is governmental discrimination. There are innumerable examples of state and federal laws targeting AAPIs, foreign minors taxes, laws restricting immigration, including the Chinese Exclusion Acts, city ordinances purporting to regulate laundries, and anti-miscegenation laws. Today, we highlight the pigtail ordinance case and a pair of pandemic cases.
The pigtail ordinance case. In 1876, the California State Legislature passed the cubic air law, which required at least 500 cubic feet of space for each adult living in a residence. The law targeted the Chinese, many of whom lived in cramped quarters in San Francisco's Chinatown. Violators were guilty of a misdemeanor and were subject to a fine or imprisonment or both. An unintended consequence of the cubic air law was that the jails became overcrowded, as many Chinese were arrested and would not or could not pay the fine. As the jails filled, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed another law, the Pigtail Ordinance. It required all male prisoners in city jails to have their hair cut to a uniform length of 1 inch from the scalp. Most of the Chinese men in San Francisco kept their hair in a queue, and its loss was a mark of disgrace. The ordinance was enforced only against the Chinese. Ho Ap Kao, a Chinese laborer in San Francisco, was convicted in April 1878 of violating the cubic air law and sentenced to a $10 fine or 5 days in prison. He failed to pay the fine and was imprisoned. The sheriff in charge of the jail cut off his queue. Ho Ap Kao sued the sheriff for $10,000 in damages, and he won. Justice Stephen Field wrote for the Federal Circuit Court.
In our country, hostile and discriminating legislation by a state against any person of any class, sect, creed, or nation, in whatever form it may be expressed, is forbidden by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. It is certainly something in which a citizen of the United States may feel a generous pride that the government of his country extends protection to all persons within its jurisdiction, and that every blow aimed at any of them, however humble, come from what quarter it may, is caught upon the broad shield of our blessed Constitution and our equal laws. The plaintiff must have judgment, and it is so ordered.
The bubonic plague cases. At the turn of the 20th century, there was worldwide fear of a pandemic, the bubonic plague. On March 6, 1900, San Francisco officials gathered at a Chinatown coffin shop to examine the body of a Chinese man. They suspected the plague.
Within hours, the Board of Health ordered a quarantine of Chinatown.
Police officers spread out around 12 city blocks, stringing ropes across key intersections, blocking pedestrians and wagons from entering or leaving. Before doing so, the police made sure that all white persons who could be found were escorted out of the area.
Within a few weeks, the San Francisco Board of Health passed a resolution requiring all Chinese residents, if they wish to travel out of the city, to be inoculated with the serum known as the Halfkin prophylactic, an anti-plague vaccine made from the living bacteria of the bubonic plague, which sometimes caused severe side effects. The resolution applied only to the Chinese and Asiatics. Other residents of the city could depart from and return to the city without being inoculated.
The Board of Health soon passed additional resolutions, formally quarantining Chinatown. The board sought to justify the quarantine by arguing that in the prior 3 months, there had been 9 deaths from the bubonic plague in Chinatown.
The Chinese quickly took action. Wang Wai, a resident of San Francisco, challenged the inoculation resolution, and Zhu Ho, who operated a grocery store in Chinatown, challenged the quarantine. Both argued that the resolutions unfairly targeted the Chinese, and both prevailed.
Judge William Morrow wrote for the Circuit Court for the District of California in both cases. In the inoculation case, he concluded,
the regulations are not based upon any established distinction in the conditions that are supposed to attend this plague, or the persons exposed to its contagion. They are boldly directed against the Asiatic or Mongolian race as a class, without regard to the previous condition, exposure to disease, or residence of the individual. And the only justification offered for this discrimination was defense counsel's suggestion that this particular race is more liable to the plague than any other. No evidence has, however, been offered to support this claim, and it is not known to be a fact. This explanation must therefore be dismissed as unsatisfactory.
And in the quarantine case, Judge Morrow rejected the city's contention that 9 residents of Chinatown had died from the bubonic plague.
The evidence here is clear that this is made to operate against the Chinese population only. While the Board of Supervisors has quarantined a district bounded by streets, certain houses are excluded. For instance, on Stockton Street, in the 900 to 1000 block, there are 2 places belonging to persons of another race. And these persons and places are excluded from the quarantine. Although the Chinese similarly situated are included. It is in effect a discrimination. And it is the discrimination that has been frequently called to the attention of the federal courts, where matters of this character have arisen with respect to the Chinese.
Modern day discrimination. We turn to more recent times. As the country moved deeper into the 20th century, the hostility and violence directed against Asian Americans persisted. The internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans during World War II amounted to both expulsion and government-sanctioned discrimination.
Post-war era did see a change in perception as fears of the yellow peril began to mix with the image of the model minority, a concept that may have given some Asian Americans hope that their acceptance in this country had been achieved. It was seen by others, however, as merely another in a long line of wedges designed to discourage the collaboration with other minority groups, hyped at a time when African Americans were pushing back against their experience of discrimination and violence in the 1950s and 60s.
The yellow peril concept has never faded away completely, but returns at times of stress. We take a closer look at 2 more recent cases arising from anti-Asian violence: the murder of Vincent Chin and the Vietnamese fishermen versus the Ku Klux Klan, drawing from our prior reenactment.
Building our legacy, the murder of Vincent Chin. On June 19, 1982, just outside Detroit, Vincent Chin, 27 years old, of Chinese ancestry, a working class American citizen, engaged to be married the following week, went out with friends for a bachelor party. At a strip club, they encountered two men, Ronald Evans and his stepson, Michael Nitz. There was an altercation. It continued outside. A few blocks away, Nitz held Chin down as Evans swung a baseball bat. Chin's head was split open, and he died 4 days later.
Evans and Nitz were charged with second-degree murder, but the prosecutors offered a plea bargain to manslaughter. Both men accepted. At sentencing in Wayne County Circuit Court on March 16th of 1983, both men were represented by counsel, but no prosecutor appeared, and the victim's family and friends were not notified. The judge sentenced each defendant to 3 years probation and a $3,000 fine.
The community reaction. In the early 1980s, the subject of race was largely Black and white. The Asian American community, however, was galvanized by the notion that a Chinese American could be beaten to death with his killer sentenced only to probation and a fine. These two men were white auto workers in Detroit. One was out of work at a time when the US auto industry was under tremendous pressure from Japanese imports. Detroit in 1982 was perhaps the hardest place in America to be Asian American. There were stage scenes of politicians and union leaders demolishing Japanese imports. That Jap crap was sledgehammers.
Because of the efforts of the Asian American community, the Justice Department received thousands of letters and signatures on petitions urging prosecution. The Reverend Jesse Jackson became the first national political leader of any race to speak out against violence against Asians, appearing with Lily Chin, Winston's mother, in San Francisco's Chinatown. In November 1983, a federal grand jury in Detroit indicted Evans and Nitz for interfering with Chin's right to use and enjoy a place of public accommodation, the Fancy Pants Lounge, on account of his race and conspiracy to do the same.
The federal prosecution. The case was assigned to Judge Anna Diggs Taylor, one of the first African-American women to be appointed to any federal court in the country. Trial commenced on June 5th, 1984. It was undisputed that Evans and Nitz killed Vincent Chin, but there was a sharp dispute over the issue of motivation. The government had to prove they acted because of Chin's race.
One of the most important witnesses at the trial was Choi. He and two other of Vincent's friends were celebrating with Vincent that night. On direct examination, Choi described the events leading up to the bachelor party and then testified about the encounter with Evans and Nitz that ended with a fatal beating.
Then what happened?
Well, we were still sitting. Then all of a sudden I heard Vincent say, "Scram." I turned around and I saw the two men right behind us, three to five steps.
And what did you do?
Well, I scrammed. I ran north of the McDonald's.
And how far did you run?
30 yards, and then I turned back.
What did you see?
I saw Vincent running across, just about getting to the median. Then the younger man came up and tried to grab him from behind and pull him around. Then they were scuffling and the older man came with the bat.
And what did you see when he approached Vincent with the bat?
Vincent was still trying to get away from him. And then the older man, he couldn't run too fast. He kind of hobbled. He took a swing at Vincent's knees.
Then what happened?
At that point, on his knees, one swing, upper section on Vincent, and he blocked like this.
And then what happened? What did you see Vincent doing?
Well, he was going down slowly like this, and then the old man took a swing right at his head.
How many times did you see him swing the bat?
Ooh, the first blow, I saw it very vividly.
And where did that blow land?
Right here.
And after that?
One more blow to the head while Vincent was going down. He kept swinging, and I don't know whether it was connecting or not, but I couldn't believe it.
And what did you do?
Well, I ran back. I just ran to Vincent.
And what did you see when you got there?
Well, all of a sudden I saw guns, service guns, and then I stopped abruptly and I saw a black man holding a gun, and he pulled out a badge like that, and he told the older man to drop his bat.
Now, when you went over to Vincent, was he conscious?
he was still conscious.
Was he saying anything?
Yes, I cradled his head and I said, "Hey, Vincent, are you all right?" And he was saying, "Fight, fight, it's not fair."
Was he speaking Chinese?
Yes, in Chinese.
After the government rested, the defendants put on a brief defense case. Evans testified and denied making any comments about Chin's race or being out of work. He claimed that he blacked out and could not remember beating Chin to death.
The lawyer summed up on June 26, 1984. The prosecutor focused on the issue of race as a motivating factor.
There really is only one reasonable explanation for Vincent Chin's brutal killing. In the minds of Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz, Vincent Chin was a Chin who dared to stand up to them. Vincent Chin and his friends were having a good time spending a lot of money, and that bothered Ronald Evans. And Ronald Evans began a barrage of racial insults, obscenities directed at Chin's mother. He was talking about foreign cars, and because of you motherfuckers, we in the auto industry are out of work. But ladies and gentlemen, you don't have to decide that Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz acted with any racial intent just on the basis of a few derogatory remarks. Rather, examine what they did, and you will be convinced why they did it. The brutality and the ferocity of the attack on Vincent Chin tell you that this was no mere barroom brawl that got out of hand. After Michael Nitz got Mr. Chin in a bear hug, Evans' savage and repeated use of that bat, even after Chin lay motionless on the pavement, cannot be reasonably explained by mere anger or revenge. This was violent hatred turned loose. This was years of pent-up racial hostilities and rage unleashed. This was a modern-day lynching, but there was a bat instead of a rope.
On June 28th of 1984, the jury found Evans guilty of violating the civil rights of Vincent Chin on account of his race. On September 18th of 1984, Judge Taylor sentenced him to 25 years in prison.
On appeal, the Sixth Circuit reversed. While the court rejected Evans's argument that the federal civil rights laws did not protect Orientals, it held that Evans was denied a fair trial. The court was most troubled by Judge Taylor's refusal to allow the defense to introduce tape recordings of meetings the witnesses had with their attorney before trial.
On remand, Evans renewed his motion for a change of venue. This time, Judge Taylor granted the motion. Ironically, the Asian American community's success at publicizing the case was a factor in causing its transfer from Detroit, a city with a Black majority and a history of civil rights, caught in the economic woes afflicting the automotive industry, to Cincinnati, a city known for its Southern sensibilities.
On May 1st, 1987, the jury returned a verdict finding Evans not guilty. Ultimately, he never served a full day in jail. He entered into a $1.5 million settlement with Chin's family, but never paid it. He currently owes the estate more than $8 million.
We turn next to the Vietnamese fishermen versus the Ku Klux Klan, where Vietnamese immigrants found an ally against white supremacy in the Southern Poverty Law Center.
The Vietnamese fishermen v. the Ku Klux Klan. At dusk on February 4th, 1981, several hundred people gathered in Santa Fe, Texas, a few miles from the town of Seabrook on Galveston Bay. The local fishermen faced stiff competition from Vietnamese refugees who had resettled in the Gulf Coast in the late 1970s after the fall of Saigon. The plan for assistance. Louis Beam, the Grand Dragon of the Texas Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, addressed the crowd in his white Klan robe. He gave federal and state authorities what he called a Grand Dragon's dispensation, 90 days to resolve the issues in the Bay. 90 days coincided with the start of the shrimping season on May 15th, 1981. Beam explained.
If the authorities do nothing, this entire Gulf Coast is going to be a difficult place to live. It's going to be a hell of a lot more violent than it was in Korea or Vietnam. If you want our countries for the whites, you're going to have to get it the way our founding fathers got it, with blood, blood, and blood. the Ku Klux Klan is more than willing to select from our ranks of American fishermen some of our more hardy souls and send them through our training camps. And when they come out, they'll be ready for the Vietnamese.
An old shrimp boat had been brought to the rally. On it were painted the words USS Viet Cong. Someone poured diesel fuel on the boat, with the crowd chanting, "Fight,
fight, fight!"
Fight, fight, fight. Beam set the boat on fire, shouting,
"This is the right way to burn a shrimp boat. This is in-service training."
In the weeks that followed, there was more violence and threats of violence directed not just against the Vietnamese, but also against those who did business with them. And on March 15, 1981, a group of local fishermen and Klansmen, some wearing robes and hoods, some carrying shotguns and assault weapons, steered a shrimp boat up to the dock of the leader of the Vietnamese fishermen, Colonel Nam. They had on board a cannon and a human figure hanged in effigy on the rigging of the boat's stern.
The story of the conflict was covered in the New York Times. When the chief trial counsel and co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, Morris Dees, learned that the Ku Klux Klan had been invited to help the American fishermen, he dialed information for Seabrook and soon reached Colonel Nam. Just a few weeks later, the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association filed suit in federal court in Houston, seeking a preliminary injunction to prevent Beam and the Klan from carrying out their threats of violence.
Judge Gabrielle Clark McDonald was the first African-American appointed to the federal bench in Texas, and only the third African-American female federal judge in the country. She had been a judge for only 2 years when the suit brought by Vietnamese fishermen was randomly assigned to her. She promptly granted plaintiffs' request for expedited discovery and scheduled the hearing on their motion for preliminary injunctive relief for May 11th, 4 days before the start of the shrimping season.
Louis Beam arrived for his deposition wearing his white Klan robe, and as Colonel Nam noticed, concealing a gun beneath his. When he refused to answer any questions, plaintiffs applied to Judge McDonald for relief. Judge McDonald ordered all further depositions to be taken at the office of the U.S. Attorney with a U.S. Marshal in attendance, and further ruled that no witnesses could carry weapons into depositions. A few days later, plaintiffs presented another application to Judge McDonald, this time because of Mr. Beam's bizarre and threatening behavior during a deposition. Judge McDonald ruled promptly.
Gentlemen, I am not going to grant your request for protection by U.S. Marshals. However, I am going to enjoin Mr. Beam and the other defendants from contacting plaintiffs and their counsel, and from making threatening and vile remarks, unsolicited hand gestures, and other distracting actions towards plaintiff's counsel. Mr. Beam, if you fail to comply, I will find you in contempt.
Judge McDonald also ruled promptly on defendant's motion to disqualify her on the grounds that she was personally biased against. At the hearing on the motion, Beam referred to the judge as a negress and stated as follows.
"I have no more confidence that I could get any fair trial here in front of you than you would feel were you to go as a defendant in front of the Ku Klux Klansman who was a judge. I know the prejudice your people have against the Klansmen."
Judge McDonald denied the motion, ruling from the bench at the conclusion of the hearing. She told the Klan leaders,
You are not entitled to a judge of your choice. You are entitled to a judge who will give you a fair trial. I am deeply committed to equal justice under the law, and you will get it. You are entitled to nothing more and nothing less.
The preliminary injunction hearing began on Monday, May 11th. Plaintiffs' witnesses included American dock owners who testified about the threats they'd received for doing business with the Vietnamese, and Vietnamese fishermen who testified on the acts of intimidation and their own fear. One fisherman's testimony was translated by his 10-year-old son, who wanted to be a lawyer and was allowed to sit in the empty jury box for the remainder of the proceedings.
On May 14th, the day before the fishing season was scheduled to begin, the court ruled from the bench temporarily enjoining defendants from engaging in acts of violence against the Vietnamese. The court thereafter converted the preliminary injunction into a permanent injunction, and on June 3rd of 1982, enjoined the military operations of Beam's so-called Texas Emergency Reserve.
The Klan did not appeal any of Judge McDonald's decisions. She later revealed that while she presided over the case, she and her family received death threats and one-way tickets to Africa.
We return to the present as the country deals with a new plague and a nationwide wave of anti-Asian violence. The Asian American Bar Association of New York, working with the law firm Paul Vase, issued a report in February 2021 on the rising tide of hate and violence against AAPIs in New York during COVID-19. Here is Yan Chen, Executive Director of Affinity, with some statistics.
Anti-Asian hate incidents and hate crimes are notoriously underreported. Nevertheless, in New York City, reported hate crimes against AAPIs increased 833% from 2019 to 2020, even as hate crimes generally decreased by 38%. Stop AAPI Hate received reports of 10,370 incidences nationally from March 19, 2020 to September 30, 2021. The attacks continue.
We have seen there is nothing new about these attacks or about the politicians who weaponize words to encourage racism and xenophobia and the kind of tribalism that is comforting in times of stress. But the questions we must ask here are, first, why has this happened? And second, what can we do to end once and for all the hostility and violence?
So first, why has this happened? Based on what we have seen across history, there are multiple causes.
Economic competition, from the Chinese gold miners out west to the South Asian lumber mill workers in Bellingham to the Vietnamese fishermen in Galveston Bay, we saw resentment build and violence erupt because of fears that Asian Americans were bringing down wages and taking away jobs.
The weaponizing of racism for political gain. Starting with Governor Bigler in 1852 and continuing to today, too often politicians seek to rally their base by playing on the racist tropes. Former President Trump first tweeted out the phrase Chinese virus on March 16, 2020. A study of 1.2 million tweets in the week before and the week after his tweet showed a sharp rise in coronavirus-related tweets with anti-Asian hashtags. Words matter.
The pressures of national crisis. Hostility intensifies at times of national crisis. The incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, the rash of violence against South Asians after 9/11, and the recent anti-Asian attacks during the pandemic are prime examples. Today's tensions with China and North Korea only increased hostility.
The use of AAPIs as a scapegoat and a wedge. From yellow peril to the model minority, and now back to the yellow peril. Asian Americans are too often blamed for society's problems, from the bubonic plague in San Francisco in 1900 to the economic woes of the auto industry in Detroit in 1982 to the coronavirus in 2020. And too often, they're also used by the white majority as a wedge against other minority groups.
Pure racism. Finally, of course, there is the continuing prevalence of stereotypes and the notion that AAPIs must be forever foreigners in this country. Asian Americans are seen as passive, docile, and weak. To some, vulnerable targets, to others, not worthy citizens.
As for what we can do, there is no easy answer, but some recommendations have been offered. We summarize a few for your consideration.
Collect the data. There must be clear and simple ways for victims to report incidents and a consistent way to classify and report them. As Abney has pointed out in its report, both incident reporting, distribution of information are being supported by nonprofit organizations. The government and law enforcement need to play a bigger role.
prosecute hate crimes. Historically, the violence against Asians resulted in few, if any, convictions, and too often the authorities looked the other way. We saw that repeatedly in even today's brief summary, from Los Angeles to Hell's Canyon, from Watsonville to Bellingham. More recently, we saw how difficult it is to prosecute a hate crime in the case of Vincent Chin. We must do what we can to push our legislators to strengthen the law and to push law enforcement to uphold the law. Hate crimes must be prosecuted. As long as attacks against AAPIs carry no legal consequences, they will continue.
United action from within the AAPI community. In the late 1960s, a group that's called itself the Asian American Political Alliance broke with previous norms by promoting the terms Asian rather than Oriental, and by advocating for Asian pride and unity. That movement was amplified by the prosecution of Chol Soo Lee in the 1970s and by the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. The recent and continuing wave of anti-Asian violence must be met with similarly strong advocacy by a united AAPI community.
Stronger collaboration among minority groups. There is a long history of tension as well as solidarity between Black and Asian American communities. As early as 1948, the NAACP submitted an amicus brief in the Takahashi case and helped Japanese Americans obtain a significant victory in their fight against discriminatory laws. Many AAPIs marched in support of Black Lives Matter. But it is also true that many of the assailants in anti-Asian incidents have been other people of color, and it escaped no one's notice that an Asian American police officer stood by as George Floyd died. It is time to resist the wedges driven between minority groups and work together.
Strong leadership and action from Washington and state capitals. Our leaders and at the federal and state levels need to be encouraged not only to speak out in condemnation of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence, but to develop a game plan to stop the violence and then take action in accordance with that plan. Credit must be given to Senator Hirono and Congresswoman Meng for their leadership in securing the enactment of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act last year, and for pressing the Justice Department to implement it. For the statute to be effective, the Justice Department needs to take action.
Public education. Too many people know too little about the Asian American experience. As Helen Zia has said, we are not so much missing in action as missing in history. We can fix that by sharing stories like the ones discussed today. We need more AAPIs in politics, sports, the media, and popular culture, and we need them to spread the word. We need more public art campaigns like the series that honor AAPI and Black New Yorkers, originally displayed in the subway station in Brooklyn in 2020. It includes portraits of Black people as a sign of solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and as a call to end all institutional racism. Together, we can beat back not only COVID-19, but the discrimination and bias that people of color have faced for centuries. As the artist, whose parents are Thai and Indonesian, stated, "You can't help but see us, and you can't help but feel that we are reclaiming space. It is time to reclaim our space."
We close with this from the conclusion of our Vietnamese fisherman reenactment.
In a speech Morris Dees gave in 2013, he described the start of the shrimping season on May 15, 1981. Once Judge MacDonald issued the preliminary injunction, the Vietnamese were ready to launch their boats. But first, there was a custom of their country they wished to observe, the blessing of the fleet. They invited their lawyer to attend.
I got there about 5 in the morning and I was standing there in the fog. On the dock, there were 50 or 100 or so family members waiting for the boats to come out. After about half an hour, the sun still hadn't come out. Then we heard a diesel engine and a boat popped out through the fog and came by the reviewing stand. The priest blessed that boat, and another, and then another, until about 15 or 20 boats had gone out in the open waters. As I stood there that morning and the sun began to burn through the fog, I could see the sun glistening off the badges of the United States Marshals sent there to protect these American immigrants. As I looked at those officers, I thought about the majesty of our justice system at work. As I looked into the faces of these immigrants, I saw pride. Pride as they took a place at America's table. Not just finding a place at America's table, but building that table. To make this nation great, like other immigrants who've come into this country time and time again and made this nation a great nation. I not only felt proud to be a lawyer for these people, I felt proud to be an American. For the first time, I understood that our nation is great because of our diversity and not in spite of it.
I thank everybody for coming out today. I appreciate everyone's support, and please look forward to other programs that APON will be putting out. We have a few other things in the pipeline dealing with mental health and dealing with AAPI hate coming down this year.